Hello class, it's Mrs. House here to give you a quick presentation on what tragedy is. I'm fully aware that this is not your first lesson on tragedy, as you all read Romeo and Juliet last year, but I thought a quick review session wouldn't hurt. I'm hoping this will take no more than 5 minutes of your time. We'll start by asking what exactly a tragedy is. And if I knew how to go to the next slide, I would do that. Okay, here we go. Tragedy actually first gets introduced to us a very long time ago. You can see there Aristotle living during 330 BC. He wrote a really famous book called the Poetics, and there's a lot of things today that relate back to his work then, and when you go to college, you'll be probably reading about him in a philosophy or critical thinking or speaking class of some sort. But in any case, you can see here he gave a rather lengthy definition of what tragedy is. But some keywords I kind of want to focus on are things like several kinds being found in the separate parts of the play. It talks about how it's not necessarily a narrative, so again, tragedy is a play of sorts, and through pity and fear affecting the proper purgation of these emotions. Now, of course, it's a very advanced language, but let's see if we can take a much simpler approach to what tragedy is in the following slides. So, in plain English, tragedy is any serious and dignified drama that describes a conflict between the hero, as we know, the protagonist, and a superior force. And sometimes that can be the destiny, chance, fate, society, God, other man, whatever other bigger force is at play that's going to stop the protagonist or the hero from getting what it is that he wants. And a tragedy reaches a sorrowful conclusion, which kind of goes without saying. It's not going to end with a happy ending, just like we know Romeo and Juliet didn't end. So I hate to give it away, but Macbeth is definitely a tragedy. Moving on. Tragedy also has a couple other characteristics that you should know, and make sure you're going ahead and pausing at any point in time during this presentation to complete that worksheet that I gave you, just to kind of check your own understanding. But a couple things about tragedy, it deals with life's bitterness. Life is rough. Life is full of defeat, and tragedy has a way of showcasing that truth about the human experience. It involves the fall of a great man from glory to utter defeat, disgrace, and death. So think back to other tragedies or other stories you've read that end in sorrow, and how there usually has to be some sort of great man involved, because if there isn't, then the horrible thing that happens in the end to him, it doesn't seem all that, well, tragic, right? So keep it in mind that most tragedies will have that particular figure. In Macbeth, I will share with you that, like the title suggests, the tragedy of Macbeth, Macbeth does end up being our tragic figure. But I'll be giving you a lesson further along in the unit about tragic heroes. For now, let's just focus on tragedy. Tragedy, thirdly, also includes the suffering, largely both physical and psychological. So it's not just violence and blood and guts, although I will say Macbeth is one of the goriest plays you're ever going to read. It is also mental and psychological, so the internal conflict that these characters, especially the tragic character, experiences is key to understanding whether or not something is a tragedy. So we have these 5 characteristics of a tragedy in at least Shakespearean time. We have a tragic hero, a tragic flaw, a reversal of fortune, usually having to do with the tragic hero or the tragic flaw, catharsis, so there's your scholar word for the week, and finally a restoration of social order. So the rest of this presentation is going to be spent quickly going over what these 5 elements are, just so you understand what tragedy is a little bit more about, maybe a little bit more than you knew from last year. So firstly, like the previous slide suggested, there is a tragic hero needed in a tragedy. And it's someone we usually look up to, someone superior, someone like this previous slide right here talks about. Is usually a great man of glory who faces utter defeat and disgrace. And I talked a little bit about why that's needed earlier. And so we identify with him, and it's, quote unquote, tragic that this horrible thing happens to them, hence adding to the tragedy of the overall play. Secondly, there is an element of tragic flaw, and it usually is part of the hero's characteristic. So the hero is nearly perfect, but notice that word is underlined. They're not quite perfect. There is a flaw. Think about Achilles in Greek tragedies and how he was perfect except for that one point in his heel. And as we know from history and the stories tell us, that is what he actually dies from. An arrow into his heel during the Trojan War. So he has that one flaw that makes him vulnerable or weak to opposing forces. Thirdly, there's a reversal of fortune, and this is usually occurring in the plot of the play itself. So as the notes here say, the fatal flaw brings the hero down from his elevated state. So using Achilles as an example, he's this warrior during the Trojan War who is seemingly indefeatable, and yet that one arrow goes through his ankle and he does die. So that flaw brings him down from his glorious time. In Renaissance audiences, and remember, Shakespeare wrote during the Renaissance in the Elizabethan era, these audiences were very familiar with this whole wheel of fortune, what goes up must come down, and it was very much so a part of their understanding of how the world kind of works. So this would definitely fit with Shakespearean's audience. Fourth is catharsis, and by definition, and of course, I'm sure many of you will go and Google this and learn more about it. Catharsis is the audience's purging of emotions through pity and fear. So in order for a tragedy to be existing, or for a play to be considered a tragedy, there needs to be an element, usually towards the end, where the audience undoubtedly feels as though they are pulled in emotionally, either due to pity, they feel pity for this tragic hero, or for fear of what will happen to the other people or to this tragic hero. So you have this audience involvement and engagement. And we know as the audience ourselves, a good play, a good book, a good movie, anything is always going to consider the audience in its motivations and what it decides to do. And last but not least, the fifth characteristic of a tragedy is that it restores social order. So despite all these horrible things that happen, the play cannot end until the society is once again at peace. Bringing it back to Romeo and Juliet, we know that even though the two young lovers do tragically die in the end, because of their death, these two families are able to come together and end this seemingly undying feud. So there is some sort of restoration of social order. And so when we read Macbeth this next month, spoiler alert, it ends tragically, wink wink, of course it does, but there is some good that comes out of it too. So don't worry, audience, it's not all tragic. Sorry, students, I seem to go over just a little bit, but I hope that you have a better idea of what tragedy is all about, and I look forward to beginning this journey with you next week as we begin Macbeth.